Hi everyone, welcome. We're down here in my wormery and the bin you see in front of you is now 147 days old. And if you've been following its progress ever since it was 50 days old, we've been checking in on it on 10-day intervals. So you might wonder, hey, how come only 7 days this time? How come 147? Well, I checked the calendar. I won't be around. I'm out of town on the day that this bin reaches its 150th birthday, and that's days, not years. 150 days. Since I won't be here, I figured now, before I leave tomorrow, it would be the best time to just get in here and see how this horizontal migration of the worms is progressing. Do a quick haul out of whatever worms have congregated in the horizontal migration feeding zone area over the past week, and then they're heading down here into my newest bin. And it was a week ago, as I mentioned earlier, that we did this last. And at that time we had hauled out about 500 worms. And I'll just be curious to see how many we've got today. After we're done, we're going to assume that the material in the bin that is still not yet completely depopulated will need more time to allow the worms to squirm out of it. So we'll definitely rebuild that feeding zone before we put this setup back up on the shelf to continue. Alright, so let's get up on the bench and get to work. For the longest time we were always using the bubble wrap to serve one purpose, which was to maintain moisture throughout the bin. The bubble wrap has now changed purpose to continue doing the same function but in a much more isolated location, trying to recirculate moisture only over the area where we've been feeding and trying to get the worms to move into. On this side, we're still keeping things covered, but this piece of paper will allow for a fair bit of evaporation to occur. The only thing is that it's been pretty humid now. It's July, it's the beginning of July now, and we're starting to get into those dog days of summer. And where I live here in central New Jersey, I do get pretty humid summer days. So this material, even though it's not really been very much covered, is still retaining a great deal of its moisture. And I think as a result of that, it's maintaining its appeal to all of its inhabitants. All of the worms seem pretty cozy in here, even out here on the edges where there was really no cover, where it would have even had a better chance to evaporate, maybe dry out a little bit. There's just as much moisture everywhere, as far as I can tell, with even a little bit more moisture in the material that's all the way down at the very bottom. So I think what I'm going to do here is what you're seeing me do right now. I'm going to attempt to aerate this material a little bit, kind of fluff it all up, hopefully allow it to start drying out a little bit more easily. All these little air pockets, all that's going to help also with the mobility, I think, giving the worms easier access to be able to move around throughout the bin. Now here we've got a piece of cardboard. It was attempting to set sort of a perimeter between what we had been considering as our finished compost in the bin over on this side versus our horizontal feeding zone, which is where we're trying to lure the worms to. And it seems like the material is still very, very densely populated throughout with worms all over the place. There's no concentrations of worms anywhere because within this material there's no real concentrations of food. This stuff's really been left to kind of work its way down to nothing in terms of food availability. And with the attempt to let it dry and air out, we're also hoping that the moisture availability eventually starts to dip to a slightly lower level too, hopefully resulting in getting the worms to look for a more hospitable, more moist place to be. But it might take time, you know, because it is just my basement, so it's not air conditioned. If it gets humid outside, then it'll get humid down here too. So I'm kind of at the mercy of how quickly the air will be able to pull moisture out of material. So but otherwise I think the material looks really terrific over there. Let's start looking at the migration feeding zone here. A lot of this stuff I see right here on the top looks like it could certainly be preserved and maintained here as part of our rebuilt feeding zone when we get to that point. So I'm not going to haul out all of this stuff right here. I'm just going to set it aside. And we'll use it to reconstruct this feeding zone once we do our haul out of the worms. So after a week's time, I'm not really seeing like a huge mass of worms hanging out in our feeding zone quite yet. I'm questioning whether we even have the substance here for doing a haul out, or if we'd be better off kind of switching gears here and possibly leaving this to go a little bit longer, so that when we do the haul out we get a more significant number of worms as opposed to just a whole bunch of bedding and a little bit of their food. Maybe it was a little bit light on the feeding last time, so maybe the worms came in and ate everything that was in here, making it no longer as appealing as it had been originally right after it was just fed. So it is possible that the food that was put in here has been gone for a number of days, and without that there's really no lure. There's no reason to come over here. So it's possible that we can just keep going with the bedding that's in here, and it seems like it's pretty abundant. I see tons of all this stuff that we scraped right off the top, and then everywhere you look, you don't even need to go off the top. You can just go right down into the material, and it's just abundantly full of cardboard and paper and everything else like that. So we're just going to try to tidy up this migration feeding zone area a little bit. A lot of this cardboard we're seeing here was sort of a little bit of a barrier that I had created. More of just a partition, not so much as a barrier. It was punctured with holes, you know, making it easy enough for the worms to be able to get through it. But just in case that was slowing things down too, I'm not going to be restoring that. We'll just rebuild our feeding zone here and then level things off, and then the material will basically just be adjacent to each other. No separation. Here I think we're seeing some mango, except there's, you know, any of the fleshy stuff that was left on the skin has been mostly stripped off, with just its tougher, thicker skin on the outside remaining. These little, just I kind of glossed over it there in case you're new to the videos here. These are just little portions of an egg carton that I had placed in here. There should be another one, and we were just using those as sort of a cardboard platform. Oops. To put food into, possibly help us round up the worms more readily so that they go in, they don't come right back out. I don't know. I think now we're getting to the business section of this feeding zone, factoring in that, you know, light from above has probably been driving them downwards, and the fact that moisture deposits itself down low in the bin also leads to a little bit of a lure. The worms really like the moisture. So I'm just picking off whatever large chunks I can here. A couple more pieces of mango, but not many signs of anything else in here in terms of their previous feeding. Makes complete sense as to why things have slowed down here. Oh, I guess we got another little chunk of asparagus. This bin definitely has a lot of really puny baby worms. Look at the one on my index finger. All of these worms. These two on my pinky. One of them is almost invisible because it's so thin. Even the one that's kind of visible is tiny, tiny little worm on the tip of my finger. So that's a good sign. The worms in our bin are breeding. So before we start rebuilding this, let's take a quick look at how we did, you know. Even though we've moved a bunch of worms probably up here in these trays and whatnot, I think the most of the worms that we've managed to gather so far are probably right over here. You know, normally the next step would be for me to break out my little clear plastic tub that I've got right here standing by, put this wad into there, and under the bright lights the worms will continue squirming down out of view, kind of abandoning the material that's at the very top surface and allowing me to skim even more off. But I think we're just going to go ahead and we're going to grab these guys out of here. And then while we're rebuilding the feeding zone for them, or at least not for them anymore, they're leaving, as we rebuild the feeding zone for the rest of their brothers and sisters and cousins and aunts, we'll give them time to burrow down into the material. So let's do the haul out here. I was tempted to just go picking through this stuff a little bit and check it all out. I can see already there's, you know, fairly large amounts of worms hanging out over here. Seems like we left a bundle of them right down here too, so let's make sure we don't miss anyone. Okay. So I know we don't have a great number of them hanging out here on the surface, but let's give them a minute or two to dive down out of the light. And in the meantime, I'll run up to the freezer and grab a supply of food to help us get this job finished. Well, I wonder how many we got here. A lot of this bedding and everything like that can certainly stay behind, continue to serve as a foundation for our rebuilt setup over here. Some stuff like this looks like it's food. It's kind of breaking apart and it's full of worms. It's a little bit gooey. Might as well keep that over here too. Let's see how much of this I can easily skim off the top without going too crazy with it. So all this stuff out on the edge is probably pretty worm free. Well, let's leave it at that. I think we've got a pretty good bundle here. I wonder how many. I've been weighing them, and just with this much extra material alongside the worms, I feel like it's going to be difficult to estimate what the weight of the worms is relative to the weight of the material that's in here with them. But whatever, we'll give it a try. Let's get this space set back up for them. The cardboard is definitely getting broken down gradually. It's weakening, or maybe just because it's wet. Oh, look at that. Got a whole bunch of worms hanging out right on the bottom of it. Guess they found a little crevice where there was some junk hanging out that they liked, and they're just enjoying it. This other little cup, I've been positioning it in such a way that I can always reorient myself to where this chamber is, the one that's closest to the camera, away from me, on the edge. It holds a little wad of my own personal hair. Not too long ago, a little quick haircut I gave myself. All I see down here on top of the eggshell that I placed under the hair, is sort of a base. All I saw down there was one worm. So it's obviously not a huge draw item. It does seem like any place where the juices of whatever food was placed in here dropped into these little tubs, these little chambers. The worms are hanging out down there. They seem to really like it. So look at all this awesome bedding that we collected over here. We have so much. I think I'm just going to go ahead and loosely scatter some of it back over the top of this initial layer of cardboard, egg carton, whatever. Kind of loosely get some of this other carbon-based bedding type material and food scraps down on top, sort of a base, and then we'll drop in our feeding, which is a pretty generous feeding. Let's get things a little bit closer here, make it easier to see. Had a little bit of coffee. Usually I feed more, but this is all I bought down for right now. Throw in a little grit. Keep the eating happening here. Whatever remains over here, this stuff, we're going to use this to all cover up with. So we'll just put in the new food over here. I'm going to try to make this into a super appealing party spot for these worms. So we've got all of their favorites going on over here right now. We've got watermelon, we've got cantaloupe melon, we've got banana, even some more healthy stuff, some veggies, some, oh, even more watermelon. I think the corners where the watermelon bits are, that's going to be a really popular spot for them to go. It should be exciting to see. Amongst all of the delicious sweet stuff, here's some cucumber. I don't even know what this is, but that is pretty generous pile of food. I think we even have a little bit more left down here in the bottom of the bag. Wow, do I have enough material to cover this up with? It's obviously going to settle as worms start to deplete what's in there. But I guess before we try covering it up with this stuff here, let's begin backfilling this void here in between. I think that the feeding zone was maybe a little too big. I'd like to increase the surface area of the area that's trying to evaporate a little bit and spread it out a little bit more. So I think what we have here is just fine. It's going to reduce the size of the feeding zone a little bit, which I don't mind. So we'll just gradually, bit by bit, bring over a little bit at a time, and then we'll level it all off at the very end. Okay. Try to level it off. It's a big mound of food. Hope it doesn't attract insects. I will try to cover it up as best I can. So let's do that. Let's start grabbing some of this old material that we salvaged. It's a lot of newspaper, a lot of leafy material. I think if we spread it out evenly, we should be able to cover the majority of what's happening here. An old banana stem, partially eaten, a whole bunch of leafy material, cardboard, getting as much of this back over into the feeding zone as possible. We are actually trying to treat this as finished compost out here, so it'll be nice not to contaminate it. But I definitely opened up the possibility to that happening here, so a little short-sighted of me. Never mind. We'll try to recover. That's a nice thing. It is, after all, what? It's worm composting, right? Plenty of room for making mistakes. No one's watching, and the worms are pretty cool about goof-ups. They're very resilient. And maybe we can even extend or expand some of these pieces of folded up paper to help better cover. I think by being folded up this way, they kind of have some of their surface area shielded from being eaten up. This way it'll be pretty much exposed. It's a pretty nice cover we've got there. So now we'll just level things off to the best of our ability. And even though that's quite a bit higher right now in terms of height, it's got to be about a ½ inch taller than the general surface around it. But I got a feeling the next time we come in here, it's going to be much lower worms coming over to check out all that delicious food we left for them. So that's about it. That's where we stand with our 147-day-old worm bin. I'm not sure how much more time it's going to take. It could take a few sweeps like this for things to get to where we want it to be, where, you know, the worms no longer find this interesting, or they start sensing that there's better grazing over on that end. So we'll just keep doing what we can to make this side of the bin as appealing for them as possible. I'm just gonna try to even reduce the size of this a little bit more, allowing even for this material right on the very edge to ventilate. And only the stuff under the plastic should be left to recirculate moisture and remain nice and cozy for the worms. What remains? Gotta let these little guys loose. Let's get their new home out here and get started on that. Okay, so now my 9-day-old bin, the newest of my bins in my wormery, we're in here to release some worms. And luckily the worms are coming over with a little bit of uneaten food that they can share with the inhabitants of this bin. But after 9 days of being in service, this bin has got to be starting to grow hungry, especially since it's got an estimated 2,500 worm population. Well, with these bright lights here, most of the worms have squirmed out of view, and before we proceed, I'd still like to get a sense of how much this weighs, and that's to try to give us an estimate of how many worms we're launching into here. So I'm reluctant to keep picking away at stuff, even though I'd love to see this as just a tub full of worms only. I feel like I run the risk of extracting worms each time I try to pick out a piece of material. But with the lights overhead being as bright as they are, and they're pretty bright, I would think I'm starting to find that the majority of the worms hanging out at the very, very top surface have all worked their way down, and then you don't go far, and then you start seeing kind of a true mob of worms down there. So pulling off a little bit of leafy material off the top here and there might end up bringing with it a worm or two. There's a banana stem. We might be able to work this down to the point where what we're left with is, for the most part, worms. I'm building like a little circle here, a little perimeter. This piece of paper has just been hanging out here, not to indicate where feedings have occurred. Just an extra piece of paper I had laying around here. Remember, this bin has not been fed yet. It's probably getting pretty hungry. This paper is really just here to give the worm something to nibble on. It too is basically food as far as I'm concerned. I just continued picking off material, and you can see at this point I'm really getting to the point where the worms are running out of places to go, and they're really doing a great job depopulating. Here and there you do see a worm or two in this material, but you know, it is kind of more fun to watch worms squirming out of a big ball as opposed to just seeing them sitting in a big wad of compost. So I kind of like pulling them out this way. Maybe we even give ourselves a bit of credit when we put this on the scale to say, hey, we actually did haul out and already release a large number of worms just by picking off the compost off the top. So whatever, even if we're left with maybe, who knows, half a pound of worms here, or maybe not even that, we'll see. We'll be able to give ourselves another credit for another 100 or two that slid by already while we were doing this. But I don't want to go much further. I think we're in pretty good shape here. This I feel like I can weigh, and then I can at least apply some sort of a percentage, you know, or some sort of a deduction to say, hey, not all of that was worms. I can deduct a certain amount of weight to account for all the other material in there, but this way I think we can at least come up with a rough idea of what the weight of these worms here are. So let's really quickly put this on the scale and see what we got. Alright, just bring it over the scale, starting on 0. Seems to be. And what do we got? Well, that's not much, right? 6.5 ounces, of which I don't know how much is the plastic tub itself, plus the material surrounding these little guys, all of this extra stuff that came by, which, you know, truly doesn't amount to much, I'll say. So if we just round to what appears to be the nearest value, let's just say it's 4 ounces of worms. It's a quarter pound, right? Which would in most cases equate to something in the neighborhood of 250 worms. But if we're also giving ourselves credit for having probably released a whole bunch of worms when we picked off all this material, then maybe we can round that number up a little bit. So I'm going to go with, tell me if you agree. If you have a different number in mind, then let me know what you think. But I'm going to go with, let's make it 400, all right? That's how I'm going to register it. And that brings us to, in this bin now, we went from 2,500 plus another 400, 2,900. Pretty close to 3,000 worms now is what we're estimating in here. Oh wait, but we haven't launched them yet. Let's get those 400 worms in here. Okay, here we go. Ready? Bon voyage, you guys. So cool. Did we get everyone? Oh, I'm such a terrible person. Look at that. I put them right on top of a piece of paper, so they're not going to be able to squirm down now. Duh. But that should make it pretty interesting. They'll all have to kind of leave the paper before they can sense that there's material below them that they could squirm into. So let's give them a few minutes to get acclimated to their new space, and we'll check back in on them in a few minutes. Well, there you have it. Our 9-day-old bin has just received a nice injection of worms from our 147-day-old, which is now 21 weeks of age, bin. And that bin, hopefully, you know, we'll check in on it another week, another 10 days. Maybe it would be safe to wait 10 days this time with that abundant amount of food that we put in there. But maybe we'll wait only 7 days. We've been doing 10-day intervals on these check-ins, but now that we're at week 21 exactly today, maybe we wait a week and we start doing check-ins weekly just to make sure we're keeping tabs on the evacuation of the material in that bin, and also rounding up any worms that we've managed to lure out of the material. And obviously letting that stuff dry out over time is important too. So hopefully that spreading out that we did will help increase the surface area and help promote evaporation more readily. So that's it for today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's really appreciated. And also consider becoming a subscriber to the channel as well. That's appreciated too. Thanks everyone. Have a great day.